Okay, so just before we start this, I want to ask a couple questions. So last time we were here, we talked about blood. Do you guys remember what the two main components of blood are?
Formed elements.
Yes, good job, man.
Water.
And plasma.
Plasma.
Good, which is mostly made of water. Excellent. So the formed elements, there are three things that make up formed elements. Do you remember that?
Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets.
Excellent. And then plasma is mostly water, and then other stuff like
Electrolytes, proteins.
good. Right, and lots of other stuff. Good. So red blood cells, what do red blood cells do?
Carry oxygen throughout the body.
Excellent. What do white blood cells do?
Fight off infections.
Good. What do platelets do?
Clotting.
Good. And I mean, plasma has lots of stuff in it, but why do you need electrolytes in your blood?
It's like a nutrient that like your cells need.
Good. So like neurons, you have to have like sodium, potassium for nerve impulses. You have to have calcium for nerve impulses and muscle contractions. You have to have electrolytes for osmotic gradient to maintain fluid balance, kidney function. I mean, there's lots of reasons why, but I'm just babbling. Anyways, yeah, so those are some of the things we talked about last time. And so today we're going to talk about the heart. So when we talk about the blood and the heart, how does the blood and the heart, how do they relate to each other?
The heart pumps blood.
Good. And why do we need the heart to pump the blood?
To carry oxygen and nutrients to our body.
Excellent. Every cell in our body has to have oxygen. Every cell that's living in our body has to have sugar and protein and fat and electrolytes and vitamins and whatever, water and all those kind of things. And so if the blood isn't going and delivering those things to the cells in your body, then your cells are going to die. And if your cells die, then you're going to die, and we don't want to die. Our cells also produce waste products like nitrogen waste and carbon dioxide and stuff like that, which we have to get rid of. So then, of course, the blood's going to help with that. And the blood does other stuff as well. But in order for all that stuff to work, the heart is the pump that pushes it all over our body.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, do you guys have any questions from last time or any questions so far today that you want to ask or anything?
Not right now.
Okay. So when we talk about the heart is, there are different types of hearts that different organisms have. And depending on how their metabolism works and how much metabolism they need and that sort of thing, hearts will develop in certain ways to make the system more efficient. The hearts in our bodies are very, very efficient, and they're super awesome. So what happens is our heart has two sides to it that under normal circumstances are completely separate from each other. Mm-hmm. What that means is that one side of the heart is delivering blood that doesn't have as much oxygen in it, but has lots of carbon dioxide straight to the lungs. Straight to the lungs. Sorry, putting it the wrong thing. The other side of the heart is receiving blood that has tons of oxygen in it and very little carbon dioxide, and it's delivering that to the rest of the body. So because those don't mix, it means you can jam-pack this side full of oxygen, and it means you can jam-pack this side full of carbon dioxide. So you get rid of more CO2 and you deliver more oxygen to your body. So it makes the system really, really efficient, which is important for us because our bodies are really, really complex. We have tons of neurons and tons of functions going on that need lots of oxygen. And so we have to have this process work right. In some people, this wall between the two sides may be compromised. And so there's different kinds of congenital heart defects and things that people have to have repairs on. And we can talk about that more if we have time. But right now, we'll just do not that. Okay, so that means that we have blood going to and from the lungs, and we have blood going to and from the rest of the body. So the blood that's coming from the systemic parts, meaning our legs and hands, arms and head and stuff, to the heart, go to the right side of the heart, and then that will deliver the blood straight to the lungs. The blood that comes from the lungs and goes to the left side of the heart then will deliver the blood to the systemic circuit, which is the brain and the arms and legs and all that kind of stuff. And so it makes the system really efficient. The other thing that we're going to see, and then we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, is that There are a valve system in the heart, bless you, that helps make the pumping and the delivery of the blood very, very efficient as well. And so every time the heart beats, there are valves that make the blood only go in one direction. So as long as the blood keeps going in one direction, then that will help the blood move more efficiently. And if I knew a song that One Direction sings, then I would have just like jammed into that. But I couldn't think of anything that fast, so I was trying to like be like funny, but oh well. So we'll skip that. Okay, so the heart then is found inside the middle of the chest in an area called the pericardium. I mean, it's inside the area called the mediastinum. And the mediastinum is kind of like a little box, or the mediastinum. Some people call it mediastinum. But it's a little box kind of right between the two lungs and right on top of the diaphragm, right behind the sternum. And it just fills that little space. The heart's about the size of your fist. And then there's, of course, lots of blood vessels going to and from it. The heart sits inside of a sac called the pericardial sac. And the coverings of the heart have a couple different parts to them. So you have the fibrous pericardium, the parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium, and the pericardial cavity, which is between these two. So the fibrous pericardium is fibrous cartilage. It's on the outside of the heart, and it gives just a really, really tough protective covering around the outside of the heart. Then just below that, there's two layers of serous membrane. If you guys remember what those are, it's simple squamous epithelium. Mm-hmm. And one of them sits right on top of the heart. That's the visceral layer. And the other one is just right next to it. It's called the parietal pericardium. So those two are right next to each other. They're really, really close, but there's a teeny tiny little space between them that's filled with serous fluid. So the serous fluid is a viscous fluid, kind of like oil, and it sits between these two layers of super smooth, slippery fluid, so that those layers can just slide back and forth across each other. So why do you think you'd want something like this on the outside of the heart?
So as your heart's not like moving everywhere.
Good. Excellent. Any other thoughts?
Like to protect it?
Protect it. Good. That's also a really good thought. One of the other reasons is because it reduces friction. So this outside of the heart and all the stuff around it, there's not like an open space in the middle of my chest where the heart's just sitting there by itself. The lungs are right on top of it. It sits on top of the diaphragm. So every time I breathe, stuff rubs against each other. Every time the heart contracts and relaxes, it's moving and it's rubbing against all the stuff around it. And so what can happen is if you get lots of movement, but you don't have some way to reduce the friction, then you'll get tissue damage. And so it's just like if I rub my hands together for a long time, or if I'm skateboarding down a hill and I step off my skateboard and fall, which may or may not have been something that actually has happened to me in my life. And you slide across the asphalt on your hip and your elbow for like 10 feet, Supermaning, and you get a huge road rash, right? So we don't want that kind of thing to happen. So these layers around the heart, one of the things, in addition to what you guys said, is as they move and you get this movement against all the other tissues in there, then you don't get friction. Mm-hmm. And so you don't get tissue damage. Sometimes people will get infections in these layers between this visceral and parietal pericardium, and then you get inflammation, and then you start to get tissue damage, and it hurts and it causes problems. And in the heart, that's primarily called pericarditis. In other serous membranes, there might be other names like pleurisy or something like that. But anyway, so that's really important. But you can see here, I mean, this stuff is all smashed together. It's like right next to each other. And so you have to have that to kind of help protect it and then help reduce friction and, all that other stuff you guys said. Okay, so the wall of the heart has three distinct layers. So and this is inside the pericardial sac. So the fibrous pericardium is not included in this. Mm-hmm. So the epicardium is the visceral pericardium. Same thing. So this doesn't include the fibrous pericardium or the parietal pericardium. Only the visceral pericardium that sits right on the surface of the heart. Then you have the myocardium. Myo means? Muscle. So this is the heart muscle, cardiac muscle. It's one of the types of muscle, one of the four tissue types and muscle is one of the 4 tissue types, and it's one of the types of muscle in that tissue type. And myocardium has really unique features that allow the heart to work the way it works. So that's the heart. And then on the inside of the heart, there's another thin layer. So this is simple squamous epithelium. This is also simple squamous epithelium, and it lines the inside of the heart, and it creates a very, very smooth, just super smooth layer on the inside of the heart that then allows the blood to move very uniformly and easily through the body. And so that's really important because we don't want rough surfaces, because then you get turbulence, you get buildup of, it changes your blood pressure, it causes blood clotting, all those kind of things, increases peripheral resistance, and so all that stuff can be a problem. Okay, so when we look at the heart and the way the heart's put together, we talked about how there's a wall that separates the right side and the left side of the heart. There also are valves that separate the top of the heart from the bottom of the heart. And so there's 4 distinct chambers. So on the right side of the heart, we have 2 chambers. The one on top is called the right atrium. Mm-hmm. The one on the bottom is called the right ventricle. Mm-hmm. The left side of the heart, we have 2 chambers. The one on top is called the left atrium and
the left ventricle.
Left ventricle. Good job. So the atrium and the ventricles are separated by valves, are called atrioventricular valves. On the right side, usually people call the right atrioventricular valve the tricuspid. So you try to do right. So it's on the right side, or some people do. Some people don't. I don't know, whatever. The left side, the atrioventricular valve, is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. So cusp means like flap of tissue. And so the right side has 3 flaps of tissue that when the heart contracts, the ventricles contract, the blood pushes up against those flaps of tissue and they snap shut. Mm-hmm. And so that's what stops the blood from going backwards. So because we have these valves, it makes the blood go in one direction, which is great. We don't want it to go backwards because then the system isn't as efficient and we can't deliver as much blood to our body as we need, or to the lungs or whatever. So at the bottom of the cusps of the atrioventricular valves, there are thin little connective tissue fibers called chordae tendineae that then hook onto pieces of cardiac muscle on the inside of the ventricles that are called papillary muscles. So what also happens when the blood pushes against these flaps of tissue is that chordae tendineae prevent the flaps from everting. So we don't want the flaps to move upwards. We want them to go up enough so they can snap shut. And so that keeps those valves snapping shut so that the blood can't flow backwards. And then we also have 2 semilunar valves. So there's the pulmonary semilunar valve that goes from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, which is then going to go to the lungs. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then we have the atrial semilunar valve, which goes from the left ventricle into the aorta, into the aortic trunk. And so what those do is after the heart contracts and pushes the blood up against the atrioventricular valves and stops them, the only place for the blood then to go is up into these 2 tubes. So it pushes the semilunar valves open, the blood goes up in there, and then when the heart contracts and there's no pressure pushing it up anymore, when the heart relaxes and there's no pressure pushing the blood up anymore, then the gravity makes the blood fall backwards and it fills these little cusps and they snap shut. So then the blood doesn't go back down into the heart.
The pulmonary trunk, is that what connects the heart to the lungs?
Yes.
Okay. So when we talk about blood that is that flows,
that flows through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk out of the pulmonary arteries.
But so if it comes out of the pulmonary arteries from the right side to the left side, then is that what's happening? So it goes from the right atrium, right ventricle, through the pulmonary trunk to the lungs, and then out the left atrium and right ventricle, right?
Yeah. So let's, if I write on the board, can you guys see it? Yeah. So let's say, so let's talk about that for a second. But before we do that, let's just illustrate a couple things here. So first of all, in this picture, these two are the superior, inferior vena cava. Okay. They're collecting blood from appendages, from the head, from the lower appendages, and from the abdomen and stuff.
They bring in deoxygenated
yes, deoxygenated blood from the lower appendages, abdomen,
so
legs,
the blood
whatever.
coming in is from the systemic circuit.
Yes, systemic circuit, deoxygenated blood. And this is systemic circuit, but it's going to be upper stuff. Okay. And eventually, of course, they all converge on these two. And that's mostly where the blood from the right atrium comes from.
So because it's superior, which is closest to the surface, which is technically my head, all the blood from there is coming through the superior, what is it called? Vena cava.
Vena cava.
Okay. I see.
Okay. We'll say inferior. Okay, so from body. Okay, so we're coming from the body, like you said, the head, arms, legs, whatever. Eventually it's going to, of course, there's lots of in between, but eventually it's going to end up in either the inferior or superior vena cava. Then it goes into the right atrium. And then it goes through a valve. What's the valve?
The tricuspid valve, which is a atrioventricular valve.
Good. And then where is it next?
It's going to be going into
the right ventricle.
Good. And then it goes through another valve.
Yeah, it goes through the pulmonary valve.
Good.
Which then goes out to the pulmonary trunk, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And then the pulmonary trunk is going to split into the right and left
pulmonary artery, because arteries take blood away from the
heart. Yes. And that's super important. And for most of our body, it doesn't really matter, because most of the time you think about like arteries carrying oxygenated blood, which is usually true. But that's not the exact definition. You need to be careful, because a lot of times teachers will ask questions like that on your test, where they'll just make you distinguish between arteries and veins. So the definition of an artery technically isn't having more oxygen, it's moving blood away from the heart. And vein is carrying blood towards the heart. Towards
and in this case, the blood has not been oxygenated yet, because it hasn't made its way to the lungs yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So right and left pulmonary arteries. Yeah. So then they're going to split smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually they get to capillaries. And then you're going to diffuse the CO2 across the alveoli, which goes into the lungs and comes out. We'll talk about that in the respiratory system. So then we'll say 2 lungs. We'll skip all those intermediate steps right now. Breathe out. Get rid of CO2. Okay, and then breathe in. And we bring in O2. And then it's just going to go back to the heart. So then we have the pulmonary arteries. Veins, sorry.
Yeah, pulmonary veins.
And of course, there's intermediate stuff. So you have capillaries and you have venules and all different layers. But eventually they come together and form the pulmonary veins. And then the pulmonary veins dump into
the left atrium.
The left atrium. Good job. Left atrium. And then you go through a valve.
Mitral valve.
Good. And most places, mitral and bicuspid, like most people would know both of those names. And then you're in the left ventricle. And then you go through another valve.
Aortic valve.
Good. And then you go to the body. Well, we should probably say aortic trunk first. Actually, we'll say aortic trunk, ascending aorta.
I need a picture of that board.
Aortic arch. And then to the body. So that's mostly what's going to happen. And I probably should.
This is called the blood pathway, right?
Yeah, part of it. Yeah. So, yeah, in a couple slides, there'll be basically this thing. We added a little bit probably extra, and then later on, they'll add more. But for now, this is the basic idea. and you guys should probably memorize this.
Yeah.
You probably, I mean, just it's a good thing to know. You definitely are going to need to know like about the atria and the ventricles and things like that. So, just make sure you memorize it. This down here, aortic trunk is going to be important because you can have branches that come off the aortic trunk. The coronary arteries come off that.
Yeah.
The aortic arch is going to be important because then we're going to have the main branches that go to the arms and up to the head. And so we'll have to talk about that later. Okay. And then the aortic. And then you get the descending aorta, which then is going to go to like the thorax and the abdomen and then to the legs. And then we'll talk about that later. But this part right here applies really well to this lecture. And so that's kind of the basic idea. Does that clarify what you're asking about?
Yes, it sure does.
Okay. Awesome. So heart's super cool. And if you ever, I don't know, in this class, you probably won't get the chance to do this, but if you ever get a chance, that model is actually a really good model. But if you ever get a chance to like dissect a heart or something, it's actually really cool. And you can see a lot of cool things. One of the things that you notice that's a distinguishing feature here is you notice the wall of the left ventricle and the right ventricle are very different.
Yeah.
So this one's much thicker. Why do you think this one's thinner and that one's thicker?
It needs more muscle to pump the blood out.
Good. So the blood here is going all over your body.
Yeah.
The blood here is going where?
Just next door.
Yeah.
To the lungs. So
the lungs are right here.
Mm.
And so it doesn't have to pump very far for it. So it doesn't have to be as big of a muscle there to be able to do that. Okay. So this right here is kind of what we just did. Yeah. The words they use are maybe a little bit different in some cases. And we added a couple extra things at the bottom, but basically that's the same thing we just did. So maybe, and this also, same kind of thing here. So I don't know. One thing I would always tell my students to do is the night after we had this lecture, I'd tell them, go home and write this down 5 times. Mm-hmm. And if you write it down 5 times, the first 2 times, maybe you have to look and remember it. The third time you remember like most of it, but you forget some of it. And then after 4 or 5 times, you basically have it all memorized. So, you just kind of, if you just go through it and redo it, you'll be just fine. Okay, so then the next thing we're going to talk about is this whole thing is transporting blood to my lungs. It's transporting blood to my head. It's transporting blood to my feet and from all those places. Mm-hmm. But what's also true is the heart is made up of cells. Mm-hmm. So the heart itself is pumping blood all over my body, but it also has to pump blood to itself. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because the heart also needs oxygen and sugar and protein and fat and vitamins and water and electrolytes and blah, blah, blah. And it also produces nitrogen waste and carbon dioxide and blah. And so it has to pump blood to itself.
Mm.
And
That's
so
what the coronary arteries are for, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. So like we mentioned here, right after the aortic semilunar valve, which is represented by this picture here, as soon as the blood goes through that, there are 2 big branches that Nan just mentioned called the coronary arteries. And the 2 branches, one of them goes to the right side of the heart, one goes to the left side of the heart. The one that goes to the right side is called the right coronary artery. The one that goes to the left side is called the
left coronary artery.
Left coronary artery. That's, tricky. So be careful. So, and of course, this is not a cardiology class, so you're not going to have to know everything about it. But there are some of these that are really important. And so as it goes to the right side, there's going to be branches. It's going to curve around the back of the heart and so forth. And as it goes to the left side, there's going to be branches and it's going to curve around the heart and so forth. And so, there's lots of detail to this. In our notes, we talk about a couple. So I wonder, this is probably good. So in this picture here, the top one, we show an anterior view of the heart. And so what you notice is this is the left coronary artery. This is the right coronary artery. And what you notice is you can't see where they come from, but they're coming from the aortic trunk. So the left coronary artery goes behind the pulmonary trunk, and then it comes out underneath the auricle on the left side of the heart. And then you can see it go down the front of the heart. And so it doesn't just appear there, but it's coming from behind the pulmonary trunk, which you can't see because the pulmonary trunk's in the way. But they both come from the aortic trunk. And then the left coronary artery then has two main branches. The one main branch goes right down the front of the heart in between the two ventricles. It's got a couple different names. One of them is the anterior interventricular artery. So what is that? Break down that word and tell me what that means.
Anterior meaning front.
Good.
And then what was the others?
Interventricular.
So inter is inside.
Not like inter.
Inter. Okay.
Between.
So between.
Yeah.
Inter between.
Good. Yeah, good. So it goes down the front of the heart in between the two ventricles.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
It's also called the left anterior descending artery, or the LAD. So left anterior descending, so it's coming from the left coronary artery. It's on the front and it's carrying blood down, so it's descending, going down the heart.
Descending is going down.
Yeah. It's also called, kind of colloquially, sometimes people call it the widow's maker. Do you have any idea why that might be a nickname for it?
That sounds scary, like
death. It is scary because
of widow.
Yes. Because
it just makes sense, like death, no?
Because yes, that's exactly right. Because this artery is the main artery that occludes when people get heart attacks. Like if they have blockage or stenosis or something, this is the one that most commonly is the victim or is the culprit. I don't know, whatever. I don't know what the word is. So a lot of bypass surgeries have happened over the years in that heart, in that artery, I guess. Anyways, so that's left anterior descending. And then there's another artery, then the right coronary artery, the other branch continues around. You can't really see it here, but it goes around the back of the heart, and it's called the circumflex artery. And there's different types. You have a left marginal, and so forth. But it goes around the back of the heart, and then it merges with some of the other blood vessels on the back. And it creates a collateral circulatory system. And so this is really important because the heart has to have blood. The heart has to have oxygen. The heart has to have sugar. The heart has to have all that stuff. If you get a blockage here or a blockage here or something, then if there isn't some way to get blood to those muscle cells, then the heart's going to die. If too much of the heart dies or all of it dies or whatever, then you're going to die. And so, I'm going to die. I don't want to die. Someday we're all going to die, and that's okay. But I don't want to die now. And hopefully I don't die for a long time because I like living. So, yeah, it's good. Anyways, yeah, so that's the left side, mostly. We'll go back and look at the names in a second. So then the right side also comes right off the aortic trunk, comes down. It also has two main branches. On the right side, the first branch you're going to see coming off, or where it splits, the right one, this branch goes right down the right edge of the heart or margin of the heart. So margin means like border or edge. And so it's called the right marginal. And of course, again, there's other branches that we're not going to talk about. And then the part that doesn't go down the right margin continues around the back of the heart. And as it comes around the back of the heart, it goes down the middle of the back of the heart in between the two ventricles. So it's called the posterior interventricular artery. So posterior instead of anterior. So it's on the back instead of front. It's between the two ventricles, so it's interventricular. And it's also called the posterior descending artery, or PDA. And so, if you see like people, making out and the girl's arms are wrapped around her boyfriend and they're getting too much PDA, it's kind of like that because it's in the back. I don't know if that works. Anyways, whatever. That was dumb. So posterior descending or posterior interventricular. So those are the main coronary arteries. So let's go back to this picture, this previous slide, and see if we got those. So right and left, posterior interventricular, we talked about that, right marginal, circumflex branch, we talked about that a little bit. Okay, so the coronary arteries are going to take blood to the heart. Cardiac veins take blood away from the heart. So just like other cells produce waste products, the heart also produces waste products. There are four main ones that you need to know. On the back of the heart, there's the great cardiac vein, which runs right next to the posterior interventricular. It goes up the back of the heart in between the two ventricles and dumps into this fat thing that looks like a slug. You have the middle cardiac vein, which is, hold on. I said that wrong. This is the middle cardiac vein. This is the great cardiac vein that runs right next to it's kind of twisted a little bit. So compared to what I thought I was looking at. Anyways, great cardiac vein comes up here and actually forms the slug-looking thing. The middle cardiac vein dumps into that, and then the small cardiac vein comes around from the front and dumps into that. This is called the coronary sinus. Coronary sinus takes all that blood that's coming from the heart and dumps it right into the right atrium. So great cardiac vein runs right next to the anterior interventricular artery, Middle cardiac vein runs right next to the posterior interventricular artery. And the small cardiac vein just comes around, and it's kind of by the right marginal, and it comes around and dumps into the coronary sinus. And so all of those dump into the coronary sinus, and then that dumps into the right atrium. And then where does the blood go from the right atrium?
From the right atrium?
Yeah.
To the right ventricle?
Good. And then to the
aortic valve.
No, the
not aortic valve.
Sorry, pulmonary valve.
Pulmonary valve.
There we go.
And then to the
lungs.
To the
good.
Yes.
To the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary
The trunk,
arteries,
yeah.
and then to the lungs.
Got
Yeah,
it.
good. And that was what I was trying to say. Pump to the lungs. So then, it just makes sense because then it just goes to the lungs. You dump the CO2, you pick up oxygen, all that stuff. Okay, so we probably don't have time to talk about that. Let's go to this. Okay, so it's important for your heart to work. And if it doesn't work, then you're in big trouble. So one of the diagnostic tools that we use to make sure that the heart's working correctly is called an EKG or an ECG, which stands for electrocardiogram. So this measures, sorry about that. This measures electric impulses, voltage, measures voltage in your heart with respect to time. So when you look at the QRS-T wave, it's going to look something like this. We've all seen this on Grey's Anatomy and whatever emergency movies we like to watch. And what you'll do is you'll see movements. So you'll see little bumps. So you see little bumps, and you see big bumps, and you see little bumps. After the whole thing goes, it looks something like this. So the first bump is called the P wave. And then you get this big one, goes QRS. And then there's a little line here, and then you go T wave. And then there's some space, and then it starts over, hopefully.
Oh my God. I would hope so.
Yeah. So, and then it'll just keep going. So this is P, Q, R, S, T, and so forth. Okay, so, and if you look up here, you can see it. So this is a graph. So just, you guys love math. I know you love graphing. It's awesome.
So awesome.
So the y-axis is measuring voltage, and the x-axis is measuring time. So it's the voltage changes in the heart with respect to time. So if we look at this, what we're going to see is that the P wave is when the atria depolarize. So depolarization is the changing of the ions in the muscle right before the atria contract. So this corresponds to atrial contraction. The QRS wave has two things. It has ventricular Depolarization, which again basically just means that the ventricles contract. And it also shows atrial repolarization. I didn't spell it right, but whatever, you can tell what it says. So what this means is those happen at the same time. So this big wave right here in the middle, that's the QRS part, you can't separate the atria repolarization from the ventricular depolarization because they're both happening at the same time. But because this is so big, because the ventricles are so big, the depolarization of the ventricles kind of outweighs the atria. And so you get this big depolarization, this big voltage change associated with the ventricles as they contract. And then the T wave, what do you think the T wave is showing?
Can't remember.
The
It's showing
ventricular repolarization.
Good. Yeah, it's showing the repolarization of the ventricles. So that before the muscles can contract, they have to polarize. So you have to get the ions in there, and you have to get the muscles prepared. And so the repolarization step just means that this is preparing the atria for a subsequent contraction. This is preparing the ventricles for a subsequent contraction. And so if that step doesn't happen, then the muscle can't contract. So it's important. And then you have a straight line until the next P wave. So what do you think that straight line means?
It's when the heart is resting for a second.
Good. And what if that straight line is shorter between each one of these? What does that mean with respect to heart rate?
It goes up.
It goes up. So the heart rate's going faster. And if those lines get longer, then what does that mean?
You're at rest.
Then the heart's moving slower. Yeah, that you're resting, that you aren't, your heart's not beating as fast.
Okay.
Yeah, good job. Okay, so make sure you know the PQRST wave, what each one of those parts mean. That's a big one. And I don't know. And let's see what's next. Okay, so we're going to talk about blood pressure. So is blood pressure good or is blood pressure bad?
Good and bad.
It depends.
Right. Good job. Why is it good?
Because it means that our heart is doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Okay, good. If you don't have any pressure, you can't get the blood to your brain or to your stomach or whatever.
Yeah.
So we have to have blood pressure. If your blood pressure gets too low or it goes away or whatever, then you can't get oxygen to your brain, you can't get nutrients to your brain, and then you'll pass out and you'll bash your head on the sidewalk or something. But high blood pressure is really bad too, right? Why is high blood pressure bad?
Because it means your heart is pumping too hard.
Yeah.
Or it's working too hard, right?
Yeah, it's working too hard. It also can cause damage to your kidneys. It can cause damage to your eyes. It can cause damage to the inside of your blood vessels, and that can lead to blood clots. It can lead to embolisms. So yeah, so too high blood pressure is also bad too. So what are things we can do to lower our blood pressure?
Exercise.
Less stress.
Quit nursing school. No, we're not going to quit nursing school yet.
That's why I have high blood pressure.
Diet also has a big impact on blood pressure. So what kind of things can we eat that lower our blood pressure?
Veggies.
Yeah.
Fruits
and vegetables. Yeah.
Lots of water.
Yeah, lots of water. What kind of things should we not eat?
Fatty foods, greasy foods.
Fatty, greasy foods.
Lots of alcohol.
Yeah. Salt, like Cheetos. I love Cheetos, which I probably shouldn't say stuff like this because if you're going to post these, it kind of sounds like a product placement or something, but I didn't really mean it like that. But so maybe you have to delete that part. Anyways, whatever. But salty stuff is not good for your blood pressure and that sort of thing. Anyway, so regular exercise, eating healthy, those kind of things are good for blood pressure. Okay, so when we talk about blood pressure, the heart has to push the blood out to our body. And what are some of the forces that the blood has to overcome to be able to get out to our body?
I don't know.
All right, that's okay. So those forces we call peripheral resistance. So blood pressure is a component of peripheral resistance and cardiac output. So peripheral resistance would be things like gravity. So to get blood to my head, the heart has to push it harder than gravity's pulling it down. Does that make sense? Blood clots, vasoconstriction versus vasodilation. How thick the blood is. If your blood is really, really thick, then that's going to increase peripheral resistance. If there's damage to the inside of the blood vessels, that increases peripheral resistance. If you get narrowing of the blood vessels because you get buildup of gunk on the inside of your blood vessels, it increases peripheral resistance. So if that goes up, what does that make my blood pressure do? If peripheral resistance increases, then what happens to my blood pressure, generally speaking?
It also goes up?
Yeah. So if you think about it like a math equation, if this is 3 and it changes to 5, then whatever I multiply over here is going to make that number bigger. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Anyways, so that's peripheral resistance. The second component of blood pressure is called cardiac output. The cardiac output is a component of 2 things: stroke volume and I forgot what the other thing is. Dang it. Hold on. Stroke volume and hold please. Heart rate. Yes, I knew that. Stroke volume and heart rate. Okay. What does heart rate mean?
How many beats per minute?
Yeah. So how fast the heart's beating. So in general, if you don't compensate by something else, if the heart rate goes up, everything else stays the same, then your blood pressure is going to go up. And then stroke volume, that means how much volume or how much blood is leaving the heart every time the heart contracts. So the stroke, the heart stroke or contraction, and the volume that's coming out each time. So if the stroke volume goes up and everything else stays the same, that will increase your blood pressure too. So those are the components of blood pressure. So we talk about this. When the heart beats, it's pushing blood away from the heart. And so in this picture here, what you notice is this is a graph that shows blood pressure on this, and this x-axis shows distance from the heart. So what's the general trend as you get further from the heart? What happens to the blood pressure?
It goes down.
Goes down. And out here at the vena cava and in the venules and capillaries and stuff, how high is your blood pressure? Low, and maybe even close to 0. So the heart pushes the blood away from the heart really, really well. But once it starts getting farther away, like in my hands or down in my feet, in the capillaries and stuff, then the blood pressure goes to 0. So does the blood stay in my feet?
When?
Ever?
Does it stay in your feet?
Yeah.
No, because it's constantly circulating.
Yeah. Oh my heck. Yeah. So it doesn't stay there in my arms. It doesn't stay in my head. It doesn't stay in my feet. So somehow that blood has to get back to the heart. But the heart isn't what's pushing the blood back. There's other forces that do that. And primarily those are going to be muscle contractions. So the difference between arteries and veins that maybe we can talk about next time if we have time. One of the differences between arteries and veins is that veins are very compliant, or very flaccid. And so as muscles that are surrounding veins contract, the veins will smash. And the veins have valves in them. And so when the veins smash, the valves move the blood back. We also have pressure changes that happen in our abdomen and our thoracic cavity as we breathe and as we move that also smash the veins and will push the blood back to the heart. And so those are kind of the main ways. And then gravity helps with that. There's maybe some other things too, but those are primarily how the blood gets back to the heart. And so next time we can probably talk about differences between arteries and veins if you want.